The day my ex-husband's wedding announcement appeared in the society pages, I performed a 12-hour surgery that saved twin babies. While Philip was pledging his love to wife number 3, I was literally holding 2 tiny hearts in my hands, willing them to keep beating. If that's not a metaphor for our marriage, I don't know what is. I'm Palmer, and for 10 years I was married to a man who made sure I never forgot I couldn't give him children. The irony of being a pediatric surgeon who couldn't conceive wasn't lost on me, or on my mother-in-law Helen, who never missed an opportunity to remind me. Dr. Kelly? Sophie poked her head into my office, interrupting my brooding. The board meeting starts in 5 minutes. I clicked away from the wedding announcement and straightened my lab coat. Thanks, Sophie, and please, for the 100th time, call me Palmer. The charity board meeting was being held in the hospital's conference room, and as I walked in, June was already setting up her presentation materials. She beamed when she saw me. Palmer, wait until you hear this. We've secured the Grand Plaza for the gala. Can you believe it? The Grand Plaza? I stopped short. That's impossible. They book years in advance. June's smile widened. Let's just say having the city's top pediatric surgeon as our founder opened some doors. Speaking of which, she slid an envelope across the table. They want you to be the keynote speaker. I picked up the envelope, the heavy cream paper feeling like a weight in my hands. 10 years ago, I was crying in hospital supply closets, between surgeries, trying to hide the bruises of Helen's words. Now I was being invited to speak at one of the most prestigious venues in the city. Earth to Palmer, June waved her hand in front of my face. You okay? Just processing, I managed. It's a big deal. You've earned it, Sophie chimed in, taking her seat. The foundation has helped hundreds of children find homes. You turned your pain into purpose. The other board members filed in, and June launched into her presentation about the gala. I tried to focus, but my mind kept drifting to the day I left Philip. He'd been particularly cruel that morning, suggesting we host a baby shower for his cousin at our house. It's not like you'll ever need one, he'd sneered when I objected. That evening, I packed 2 suitcases and walked out. The next day, I filed for divorce and threw myself into my work. 6 months later, I started the foundation for abandoned children. Palmer? June's voice snapped me back to the present. What do you think about the guest list? Sorry, what about it? We're inviting all major donors and their families, she explained. Plus, we have a surprise speaker, an 18-year-old activist who was abandoned as a baby. Her story is incredible. Ruby, Sophie added, she's been making waves in child advocacy circles. Having her speak will bring massive media attention. I nodded, already thinking about how to structure my speech. Send me her background information. I'd like to make sure our messages align. The meeting continued, but my phone buzzed with an email notification. Probably another surgery consult. I glanced down discreetly. Subject, RSVP, Philip Fernandez and Helen Fernandez. My stomach lurched. The room suddenly felt too warm. Too small. Palmer? June touched my arm. You've gone pale. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. I need some air. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths. Through the window, I could see the children's wing where I'd spent countless hours healing tiny bodies, mending broken hearts, both literally and figuratively. They can't hurt you anymore, I whispered to myself. Sophie appeared beside me, concern etched on her face. What happened in there? I handed her my phone. Her eyes widened as she read. They have some nerve, she muttered. Want me to remove them from the list? I straightened up, smoothing my lab coat. No, let them come. Are you sure? After everything they put you through? A memory flashed. Helen standing in my kitchen, waving a negative pregnancy test in my face, calling me defective. Philip watching silently, his tacit approval more devastating than any words. I'm sure, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. They wanted to see me fail. Instead, they'll watch me succeed, from the cheap seats. Sophie squeezed my arm. You're badass, you know that? My pager beeped. Emergency in the NICU. Duty calls, I said, already moving. Send me the full guest list when you have it. Will do, boss. As I hurried toward the NICU, my mind was already shifting to doctor mode. Another baby needed me. Another life hanging in the balance. Let Philip and Helen come to the gala. They'd see exactly what kind of woman they tried to break. And maybe, just maybe, they'd learn that some forms of motherhood don't require DNA at all. The flowers have to be white orchids, I insisted, watching June's eyebrows rise. Trust me on this. We were standing in the Grand Plaza's ballroom, surrounded by swatches, samples, and my brother Edward's increasingly dramatic sighs. 3 weeks until the gala, and every detail mattered. White orchids are Helen's favorite, I explained. She used to lord it over me that I could never arrange them properly at her precious garden club meetings. June's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. So we're going for elegant spite. I can work with that. Is this really healthy? Edward asked, looking up from his phone. Using flowers as revenge? The flowers are just flowers, I said, though we both knew better. Besides, I'm paying for them. Sophie burst through the double doors, waving a folder. Palmer, Ruby's team just sent over her bio and speech outline. You need to see this. I took the folder, scanning the first page. Born in Chicago, abandoned at 3 months, adopted at 6. My voice trailed off as I reached a particular detail. Wait, she was found at St. Margaret's Hospital. What's significant about that? June asked, peering over my shoulder. It's where Philip's family had their private wing, I said slowly. They practically owned half the hospital board back then. Edward moved closer. Sis, don't go down this rabbit hole. It's probably just a coincidence. Everything's a coincidence until it isn't, I muttered, still reading. Sophie, can you get me more information about Ruby's case? Already on it, Sophie nodded. But focus on today first. The caterers are waiting in the kitchen. The next few hours blurred into a parade of food tastings and seating arrangements. June expertly guided us through decisions about lighting, music, and table settings, while I tried to keep my mind from spinning conspiracy theories about Ruby's connection to St. Margaret's. Palmer, Edward caught my arm as we were leaving. You're doing that thing where you get too intense. Remember what happened at the hospital fundraiser last year? I winced. That donor deserved to be called out for his comments about broken children. Yes, but maybe not with his face in the chocolate fountain. That was an accident, I protested, then sighed. Fine, I'll behave at the gala. Promise? Unless Philip or Helen start something. Edward groaned. That's not promising. Back at the foundation office, Sophie was waiting with a stack of papers. You're not going to believe what I found. Tell me, I said, closing my office door. Ruby was abandoned on March 15th, exactly 10 years ago, the same day Helen hosted that huge charity ball at St. Margaret's. My hands went cold. There's more, Sophie continued. The nurse who found Ruby noted a distinctive silver bracelet left with her, custom-made with a family crest. The Fernandez crest, I whispered. The report doesn't specify, but the timing, the location. A knock interrupted us. June poked her head in. Sorry, but the press release needs approval. We're announcing Ruby as the surprise speaker tomorrow. I grabbed my coat. Hold that thought. I need to check something first. Where are you going? Sophie called after me. To visit an old friend. 30 minutes later, I was sitting in a small cafe across from Maria, who had been Helen's housekeeper for 20 years before retiring. I remember that night, Maria said, stirring her coffee. Mrs. Helen was very strange, nervous. She kept making phone calls from the study, speaking in whispers. Did you hear anything? Maria leaned forward. Just one thing. She said, the problem is handled, but it cost everything. I thought she meant money, but... She shrugged. The next day, Mr. Philip was different. Angry all the time. More cruel to you. My phone buzzed. A text from June. Guest list finalized. Philip RSVP'd +1, not Helen. Maria, I said carefully, did Helen ever mention a baby? Around that time. The old woman's eyes widened slightly. No, but there was a room. Always locked. I heard crying once, but Mrs. Helen said it was the TV. She paused. The next day, everything in that room was gone. I paid for our coffees and hugged Maria goodbye, my mind racing. Back in my car, I called Sophie. Find everything you can about Helen's finances from March that year. And Sophie, be discreet. Already on it, but Palmer, if what you're thinking is true, then Ruby isn't just our surprise speaker, I said, gripping the steering wheel. She's the key to everything. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Looking forward to your big night, Palmer. Hope you don't mind, but I have a few suggestions for your speech. Philip. I stared at the message, feeling the old familiar mix of rage and fear. But this time, something else pushed through. Determination. Game on, Philip, I whispered to my empty car. Game on. The Grand Plaza sparkled like a diamond, but all I could focus on was the champagne glass trembling in my hand. Philip hadn't arrived yet, but his presence already haunted the room like a ghost. You look stunning, June appeared beside me, adjusting my emerald green gown. Those orchid centerpieces are perfect, by the way. Helen would hate how perfect they are. Speaking of Helen, Sophie rushed over, slightly breathless. She's here. What? I spun around. She didn't RSVP. She's Philip's +1. Of course she was. I spotted them at the entrance. Philip in an ill-fitting tuxedo that screamed rental. Helen wearing a dress I recognized from years ago. They'd fallen far from their society pedestal, but their arrogance still filled the room. Palmer, Helen's voice carried across the marble floor. Darling, you've done so well for yourself. I plastered on my surgeon's smile, the one I use when telling parents their child's prognosis is uncertain. Helen. Philip. What a surprise. Not entirely. Philip stepped closer, his cologne too strong, too familiar. We have some business to discuss. This is a charity gala, not a business meeting. Helen's perfectly manicured hand gripped my arm. We've had some financial setbacks. Nothing serious, but we thought, given our history... Our history? I pulled away. You mean the decade you spent destroying my self-worth? Now, Palmer, Philip's voice dropped to that patronizing tone I knew too well. Let's not cause a scene. We're simply offering a mutually beneficial arrangement. Your foundation could use some experienced board members. A waiter passed with champagne. I grabbed a glass, mostly to stop myself from throwing one at Philip's face. Palmer, Edward's voice cut through the tension. Ruby's car just pulled up. Helen's face twitched. Ruby, our keynote speaker, I said, watching her carefully. Surely you saw the press release. We've been traveling, Helen stammered. Philip, didn't you mention something about a speaker? But Philip was staring at the entrance, his face suddenly pale. I followed his gaze to see Ruby walking in, radiant in a silver dress that caught the light like stars. Excuse me, I moved past them. I need to greet our guest of honor. Ruby's smile lit up her entire face as I approached. Dr. Kelly, thank you so much for having me. Please call me Palmer. Your story has inspired so many of us. From the corner of my eye, I saw Helen clutching Philip's arm, whispering urgently. He shook her off, making his way toward us. Miss Ruby, he extended his hand. I'm Philip Fernandez. I used to be quite involved in children's charities myself. Ruby shook his hand politely, but I noticed her slight recoil at his touch. How wonderful. Which charities? Oh, various organizations, primarily around St. Margaret's Hospital in Chicago. My heart stopped. Ruby's smile faltered for just a moment. That's where I was found. Really? Philip's voice dripped with false surprise. What a remarkable coincidence. Philip, I cut in sharply. Don't you have some networking to do? He ignored me, focusing on Ruby. You know, I was on the hospital board back then. I might even remember your case. That's enough, I stepped between them. Ruby needs to prepare for her speech. But Ruby's eyes had gone wide. You were on the board. Do you... Do you know anything about my birth parents? Helen appeared suddenly, grabbing Philip's arm. Darling, let's not bore the young lady with ancient history. It's not boring to me, Ruby insisted. I've been searching for answers my whole life. The room seemed to spin. Helen's fingers were leaving white marks on Philip's sleeve. Ruby's eager expression. The silver bracelet glinting on her wrist. Wait, that bracelet. Ruby, my voice came out steadier than I felt. That's a beautiful bracelet. Oh, this? She touched it gently. It was left with me when I was abandoned, the only thing I have from my birth family. Philip's face went from pale to grey. Helen looked like she might faint. Fascinating, I said, not taking my eyes off Philip. It looks like an old family crest. Palmer, Philip's voice held a warning. A word. Can't it wait? Ruby's speech is about to start. Now. He grabbed my elbow, but I twisted away. Don't touch me, I hissed. Ever again. Sophie appeared with perfect timing. Palmer, we need you on stage to introduce Ruby. As I walked away, I heard Helen's harsh whisper. You promised this was handled. It was, Philip snapped back. Someone must have talked. I took the stage, adjusting the microphone. The spotlight felt warm on my face as I surveyed the crowd. Philip and Helen huddled near the exit, their world clearly unraveling. Ruby stood ready in the wings, clutching her notes, that damning bracelet catching the light. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, tonight we're honored to hear from someone very special. Someone whose story proves that family isn't always what we expect it to be. Philip's face contorted with recognition. He knew I knew, and this was just the beginning. Ruby took the stage with the kind of grace that comes from surviving storms. Camera flashes erupted as she approached the podium, that silver bracelet catching every spark of light. My story begins in a hospital hallway, she started, her voice clear and strong. A place where most stories begin, but mine began with an ending. From my seat in the front row, I watched Philip fidget with his collar. Helen had positioned herself near the exit, her knuckles white around her clutch purse. I was left with two things, Ruby continued, a silver bracelet and a note that read, I'm sorry. For years, I thought that apology was for abandoning me. Now, I wonder if it was for something else entirely. Sophie slipped into the seat beside me. Security's on alert, she whispered, in case Philip tries anything. I nodded, not taking my eyes off Ruby. She was describing her years in foster care, the constant questions about her origins, the way she'd channeled her pain into advocacy. The bracelet became my compass. Ruby held up her wrist. Each time I felt lost, I'd trace the pattern of this crest, wondering about the family it belonged to. Philip stood abruptly, but Edward blocked his path to the exit. I hadn't even noticed my brother moving into position. Recently, I've learned something interesting about this crest. Ruby's voice took on a different tone. It belongs to a prominent Chicago family, a family with deep ties to St. Margaret's Hospital. The room went deadly quiet. Helen swayed slightly, reaching for the wall. Their name was... This is ridiculous. Philip's voice boomed across the ballroom. You can't just make accusations based on jewelry. Ruby faltered for a moment, but her spine straightened. I wasn't making accusations, sir. I was simply sharing my story. Your story? Philip laughed bitterly. You don't know the first thing about your story. I stood up. Philip, that's enough. No, Palmer, it's not enough. He stormed toward the stage. You orchestrated this, didn't you? Dug up ancient history to humiliate me. Security started moving in, but Ruby held up her hand. Sir, I don't know what you're talking about, but you seem very invested in my ancient history. Philip, Helen's voice cracked. Please, let's go. Why? Ruby asked suddenly. Why do you need to leave? What are you afraid of? The room held its breath. Philip turned slowly, his face contorted with something between rage and fear. You want to know what I'm afraid of? I'm afraid of entitled little girls who think they can waltz into other people's lives and demand answers. Other people's lives? Ruby's voice shook slightly. You mean like the lives of the people who abandon me? Sometimes, Helen cut in sharply. Abandonment is a kindness. The words hung in the air like poison. I watched Ruby's face crumple for just a second before she steeled herself. A kindness, she repeated. Was it kind to leave a 3-month-old baby alone in a hospital corridor? Was it kind to give her nothing but a bracelet and lifetime of questions? It was kinder than the alternative, Helen shouted, then clapped her hand over her mouth. The room erupted in whispers. Cameras clicked frantically. June was trying to usher reporters back, but the damage was done. Mrs. Fernandez, Ruby's voice was eerily calm. How do you know what the alternative was? Philip lunged forward. This ends now. Security, Sophie called out, but I was already moving. I reached the stage just as Philip did, placing myself between him and Ruby. Don't you dare, I hissed. Don't you dare hurt her again. Again? Ruby whispered behind me. Philip's face went slack. He stumbled backward, looking between Ruby and Helen, who had crumpled into a nearby chair. Palmer, he pleaded, his voice suddenly different. We can talk about this. Make arrangements. The foundation needs funding, and we need... We, I laughed. There is no we, Philip. There never really was. Ruby stepped forward, that damned bracelet glinting like truth in the spotlight. Mr. Fernandez, do you know who I am? The silence that followed was deafening. Philip opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and fled toward the exit. Helen scrambled after him, leaving her designer clutch behind. I'm so sorry, I turned to Ruby, who stood frozen on stage. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. She touched the bracelet gently. You knew, didn't you? That's why you invited them tonight. I suspected, I admitted, but I didn't know for sure until I saw his reaction to you. Ruby nodded slowly, then turned back to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. Shall we continue with the real purpose of tonight? Supporting children who, like me, needed someone to fight for them when others wouldn't. The audience burst into applause, but I barely heard it. I was watching Ruby, seeing strength where Philip had seen inconvenience, seeing beauty where Helen had seen shame. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard Karma laughing. Helen's clutch, I said, turning the expensive purse over in my hands. She never goes anywhere without it. Sophie, June, Edward, and I were huddled in my office the morning after the gala. Ruby had gone back to her hotel, escorted by security, while the media frenzy outside the Grand Plaza reached fever pitch. Look inside, Sophie urged. She always kept everything important in there. That's invasion of privacy, Edward warned. So is abandoning your grandchild, I snapped, unzipping the bag. Inside, I found the usual suspects. Lipstick, tissues, a wallet. But tucked into a hidden compartment was a worn envelope. What is it? June leaned forward. My hands trembled as I pulled out several yellowed papers. Hospital records, from St. Margaret's. I started reading aloud. Patient admitted March 14th. Complications during delivery. Father listed as... As what? Sophie pressed. Philip. I felt sick. He wasn't just the grandfather. He was Ruby's father. The room went silent. Edward sank into a chair. That's why Helen was so involved. She was covering for her son. There's more, I continued reading. Mother listed as Catherine. She was only 19, a nursing student at St. Margaret's. Oh, God, June whispered. That's why they had to hide it. The scandal would have ruined them. A knock at the door made us all jump. Sophie quickly gathered the papers as I called out, Come in. It was Ruby. She looked exhausted but determined. Dr. Kelly, Palmer, can we talk? Everyone else filed out quietly, Sophie squeezing my hand as she passed. Ruby took the seat across from me, her fingers automatically going to that silver bracelet. I couldn't sleep last night, she said. I kept thinking about Mr. Fernandez's reaction, Mrs. Fernandez's words. I need to know the truth. I took a deep breath. Ruby, what I'm about to tell you, it's going to hurt. More than not knowing. Maybe. I pulled Helen's clutch from my drawer. Your grandmother left this behind last night. Ruby's eyes widened. Grandmother? Yes, but that's not the hardest part. I spread the hospital records on the desk. Philip isn't your grandfather. He's your father. Ruby's face went white. She reached for the papers with shaking hands, scanning them quickly. Catherine, my mother was a student, a nursing student, 19 years old. And they paid her off, I said gently. Helen arranged everything. The private delivery, the adoption papers that were never filed, the cover-up at the hospital. Ruby stood up suddenly, pacing the office. All those years I imagined my birth parents as scared teenagers or desperate people who had no choice. But this was calculated, cold. Ruby, did you know? She turned to me sharply. When you invited them to the gala, I suspected something after I learned about your connection to St. Margaret's, but I didn't know the full truth until now. She nodded slowly. That's why you left him, isn't it? You saw who he really was. I left because he and Helen made me feel worthless for not giving them a child, I said quietly. The irony that he already had one. Ruby stopped pacing. What do I do now? Whatever you want. We can go public, keep it private, press charges for abandonment. It's your choice. My choice, she repeated bitterly, like the choice they took from my mother. From me? Another knock. Sophie poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, but you both need to see this. She handed me her tablet. On the screen was a breaking news article. Prominent Chicago family faces financial fraud investigation. They're not just broke, Sophie explained. They're being investigated for years of embezzlement from their family charities, including funds meant for St. Margaret's Children's Wing. Ruby made a sound between a laugh and a sob. So they didn't just abandon me. They stole from other children too. I stood up and walked around the desk. Ruby, listen to me. What they did, all of it, that's on them. Not you, never you. But I'm their blood, she whispered. Blood doesn't make family. I took her hands in mine. Trust me, I learned that the hard way. Family is what we choose. She looked down at our joined hands, then at the papers on my desk. I want to make a statement, not just about them, but about all of it. The system that let them hide this, the money that bought their silence, the people they hurt. Are you sure? Once it's out there? I'm sure. She straightened her shoulders. They don't get to hide anymore, and I don't have to either. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of pride and sadness. I'll call a press conference. Palmer. Ruby's voice was small. Will you stand with me? Every step of the way. She hugged me then, fierce and sudden, and I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about truth, justice, and maybe, just maybe, healing. For both of us. The pounding on my front door started at 6 a.m. I knew who it was before I opened it. Philip had always been an early morning ambusher. You vindictive bitch, he snarled, pushing past me into the foyer. You just couldn't let it go, could you? Don't make me call the police, I warned, leaving the door open. Edward lived next door, and I wanted him to hear if things escalated. The police? Philip laughed harshly. They're already involved, thanks to you. Did you enjoy digging through our financial records? Actually, that was the FBI. I just helped them connect some dots. He advanced toward me, but I stood my ground. You have no idea what you've done. That press conference today, you'll destroy everything. You mean like you destroyed Catherine's life, Ruby's childhood, my self-worth? Catherine? He flinched at the name. What do you know about her? I know she was 19. I know she was your student. I know Helen paid her to disappear. You don't understand anything, he spat. We gave her a way out. Money, a fresh start, after you got her pregnant and forced her to give up her baby. I didn't force. He stopped, realizing his admission. Finally, some truth, I said quietly. How does it feel? He slumped against the wall, suddenly looking old. What do you want, Palmer? Money? Power? Name it. I want you to face Ruby at the press conference. Tell her the truth yourself. Never. Then I'll do it for you, with evidence. His head snapped up. What evidence? Helen's diary, the hospital records, Catherine's signed statement. Catherine, his face went pale. You found her. Sophie's better at research than you'd think. Catherine's been waiting 20 years to tell her story. A crash from the doorway made us both jump. Helen stood there, her purse fallen at her feet, face ashen. You found that girl, she whispered. That girl, I echoed. You mean the teenager you paid to give up her baby? The one whose life you ruined to protect your precious reputation? I protected my son, Helen shot back. That little tramp was going to ruin everything we'd built. Mother, Philip warned, but Helen was on a roll. She was nothing, a scholarship student who got ideas above her station. We gave her more money than she'd ever seen. She was 19, I said again, my voice shaking. She was alone and scared, and you treated her like a problem to be solved. Better than treating her like a weapon, which is what you're doing, Helen spat. My phone buzzed, a text from Sophie. Catherine just arrived at the foundation. Ruby's meeting her now. It's too late for damage control, I showed them the message. They're together as we speak. Philip lunged for my phone, but I stepped back. You can't stop this. Watch me, he growled, reaching for his own phone. Your lawyers can't help you anymore, I said. The FBI has frozen your accounts. Your reputation is already in shreds. The only thing you can do now is try to save whatever dignity you have left. Dignity? Helen laughed hysterically. You're talking about dignity while orchestrating our public execution? No, I'm talking about finally facing consequences, about Ruby knowing the truth, about Catherine getting justice. Justice? Philip's voice cracked. You want justice? Fine. I'll tell you what really happened. I loved Catherine, but Mother here, he jerked his thumb at Helen, threatened to expose her scholarship fraud if she didn't take the money and run. Helen gasped. Philip. What scholarship fraud? I asked. There wasn't any, he said bitterly. Mother made it up, forged documents, threatened to destroy Catherine's future unless she disappeared. Helen slapped him. The sound echoed through my foyer. You weak, pathetic fool, she hissed. After everything I did to protect you. Protect me? You ruined the only real thing in my life. Then you spent years tormenting Palmer about not giving you grandchildren when you knew I already had a daughter. My phone buzzed again. A photo from Sophie, Ruby and Catherine hugging, both crying, both healing. Look, I held up the phone. This is what family looks like. Not threats, not cover-ups, not shame. Philip stared at the photo, something breaking in his expression. Helen turned away. The press conference is at noon, I said quietly. You can either be there to tell your truth or have it told for you. Your choice. Choice? Helen's voice was venomous. Like the choice you're giving us now. No, I opened my front door wider. Like the choice you took from Catherine, from Ruby, from everyone who got in the way of your perfect family fantasy. They left separately, Philip walking slowly to his car, Helen marching off with rigid dignity. I watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways. My phone buzzed one last time. Ruby. I met my mother. Thank you for everything. See you at noon. I'll be there, I texted back. We all will. The Foundation's press room was packed shoulder to shoulder, cameras flashing like lightning. Ruby stood at the podium, Catherine beside her, their matching silver bracelets catching the light. I hadn't expected Philip to actually show up, but there he was in the back row, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Helen was notably absent. My name is Ruby, she began, her voice steady. And today, I'm here to tell you a story about two kinds of family, the one that abandoned me and the one that found me. Catherine squeezed her daughter's hand. They had the same eyes, the same quiet strength. 20 years ago, a 19-year-old nursing student fell in love with her professor. When she got pregnant, his mother orchestrated a cover-up that destroyed 3 generations of lives. Philip flinched visibly. Several reporters turned to photograph his reaction. That student was my mother, Catherine, Ruby gestured beside her. And that professor was Philip Fernandez, who sits here today. The room erupted in camera clicks and hurried whispers. Philip stood up, his face ashen. "Ruby," his voice cracked. "Please." "Please what?" Ruby's tone was eerily calm. "Please don't tell them how you chose your reputation over your child, or how your mother blackmailed mine with false accusations." "It wasn't like that," he started toward the podium. Catherine stepped forward. "Then what was it like, Philip? Tell them how you promised to leave your wife, how you said we'd be a family, how you watched your mother threaten me and did nothing." "I was weak," he admitted, stopping halfway up the aisle. "I was a coward." "Yes," Ruby said simply. "You were. But this isn't just about your cowardice. This is about a system that let wealthy people hide their crimes behind charitable foundations, the same foundations that were supposed to help children like me." Sophie appeared at my side, passing me a note. I read it quickly, then stepped to the podium. "We've just received confirmation," I announced, "that the FBI has uncovered decades of financial fraud within the Fernandez Family Foundation. Millions of dollars meant for children's health care were diverted to private accounts." Philip sagged against a chair. The reporters went wild. "That money," Ruby continued, "could have helped hundreds of children find homes. Instead, it bought silence, paid for cover-ups, protected the very people who abandoned those children in the first place. But that ends today," Catherine added. "No more silence, no more shame." A commotion at the back of the room drew everyone's attention. Helen burst in, waving papers. "Stop this circus immediately," she demanded. "I have injunctions, gag orders." "Your lawyers called, Helen," I cut in. "They quit. Something about not wanting to go down with a sinking ship." "You don't understand what you're doing," she pushed through the crowd. "This isn't just about us. There are other families, other arrangements, other babies you helped hide." Catherine's voice was sharp. "Other lives you destroyed." Helen reached the podium, but security blocked her path. "I protected people. I kept order." "Order?" Ruby laughed incredulously. "Is that what you call leaving a baby in a hospital corridor?" "I left you that bracelet, didn't I?" Helen shot back. "Made sure you'd have something valuable, something to trace." The room went dead silent. Ruby stared at her grandmother. "You," she whispered, "you were the one who left me there." "Philip was too weak to do it himself," Helen spat. "Someone had to think of the family name." "Mother, stop," Philip pleaded. "No, let her talk," I said. "Let her explain to everyone exactly how she orchestrated the abandonment of her own granddaughter." Helen turned to me, eyes blazing. "You think you're so righteous, Palmer? You think exposing all this makes you a hero? You're just a barren woman playing at motherhood." The words hung in the air like poison, but this time they didn't hurt. "You're right, Helen. I couldn't have children, but I helped hundreds of them find homes, find hope. What did you do? You threw away your own flesh and blood to protect a lie." Ruby stepped forward, removing her bracelet. "I don't need this anymore. I don't need your name, your legacy, or your twisted version of family." She placed the bracelet on the podium, the silver catching the light one last time. "My name is Ruby," she stated clearly into the microphones. "I was abandoned by the Fernandez family, but I was found by something stronger. Love, truth, and people who fight for what's right." Catherine wrapped an arm around her daughter. Philip stood frozen in the aisle. Helen stared at the discarded bracelet. "This press conference is over," I announced, "but the investigation is just beginning. Thank you all for coming." As security began clearing the room, Ruby turned to me. "Palmer," she said softly, "thank you for helping me find my truth." I hugged her tightly, watching over her shoulder as Helen was escorted out, still clutching her useless legal papers. Philip followed slowly, shoulders bent under the weight of 2 decades of cowardice. "Ready to go home?" Catherine asked her daughter. Ruby smiled, leaving the bracelet behind. "I already am home. I found my real family." And in that moment, watching them walk out together, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about building something beautiful, from the ruins they left behind. The morning sun streamed through my office window as I sorted through the pile of letters on my desk. Most were from children who'd found homes through our foundation, but one heavy cream envelope stood out. Prison letterhead. "You don't have to read it," Sophie said from the doorway. "No one would blame you for tossing Philip's letter in the trash." I turned the envelope over in my hands. "Did Ruby get one too?" "Yes, she and Catherine read it together." The door opened wider as Ruby herself walked in, followed by her mother. They'd both started working at the foundation after the press conference, Catherine in counseling, Ruby in advocacy. "His sentencing is tomorrow," Ruby said, perching on the edge of my desk. 5 to 10 years for fraud. Helen took a plea deal. "Are you going?" I asked. Ruby shook her head. "No need. We said everything that needed saying at the press conference." She paused. "But I did read his letter." "And?" "He apologized. Actually apologized, not just Helen's version of, 'I'm sorry you feel that way.' He's been going to therapy in jail." Catherine sat down, absently touching her silver bracelet, a new one, matching Ruby's, that they'd bought together. "He asked about you, Palmer." "Me?" "He wanted to know if you'd found happiness, if you'd found what you were looking for when you left him." I looked around my office at the photos covering the walls. Children with their new families, Ruby's graduation speech, Catherine's counseling certification ceremony, at Sophie and June arguing over event plans in the hallway, at Edward bringing in coffee for everyone like he did every morning. "I found something better," I said. "I found purpose." The intercom buzzed. June's voice crackled through. "Palmer, the new family is here for their interview." "Send them in," I called back. A young couple entered, nervous but hopeful. Between them walked a little girl, maybe 7, clutching a worn teddy bear. "Hi," I smiled, standing up. "I'm Palmer. Welcome to our family matching program." The girl looked up at me with bright eyes. "Are you going to help me find my forever family?" Ruby moved to kneel beside her. "That's exactly what we do here. Want to know a secret? I was just like you once." The girl's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really. And now I help other kids find what I found, people who love them for exactly who they are." Catherine wiped away a tear as she watched her daughter with the little girl. I remembered Helen's words about me playing at motherhood and felt only pity for a woman who never understood that family isn't about blood or bracelets or reputations. "Should we start the interview?" I asked the couple. "Actually," the woman said hesitantly, "we were hoping to talk to Ruby first. We saw her speech online about different kinds of family. It's why we chose this foundation." Ruby beamed. "I'd love to talk with you. Palmer, mind if I take this one?" "Go ahead," I nodded. "It's your story to tell." As Ruby led the family to her office, Sophie handed me a newspaper. The headline read, "Fernandez Foundation Fraud Leads to Nationwide Investigation of Private Adoption Agencies. Your revenge turned into revolution," Sophie said softly. It wasn't revenge, I realized. Not really. It was justice. For Ruby, for Catherine, for all the children who needed someone to fight for them. "Speaking of fighting," Catherine interjected, "we've got that meeting with the State Adoption Board tomorrow. They want to implement Ruby's transparency protocols across all agencies." The intercom buzzed again. "June." "Palmer?" "There's a call from the hospital. They need you for an emergency surgery." I grabbed my coat. Some things never changed. Children still needed healing, families still needed building, and I still had work to do. "Coming," I called back, then turned to Catherine. "Tell Ruby I'll be back for the afternoon session, and—" I picked up Philip's unopened letter. "Tell her she was right. Some things don't need more words." I dropped the letter in the recycling bin as I left. Outside my office, the foundation hummed with activity. Phones ringing, families meeting, lives changing. Edward handed me my travel coffee mug with a knowing smile. "Another day of saving the world, sis?" "No," I smiled back. "Just another day of building it better." As I drove to the hospital, I thought about Helen's obsession with perfect families, about Philip's cowardice, about all the ways people can hurt each other in the name of reputation, or tradition, or fear. But I also thought about Ruby finding her mother, about Catherine finding her voice, about that little girl with the teddy bear finding her future, about how sometimes the families we choose are stronger than the ones we're born into. My pager beeped. Twins in the NICU needed surgery, just like that first day when Philip's wedding announcement had appeared. But this time, as I parked at the hospital, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about everything I'd found instead, and that was the best revenge of all.